Hey, you're here. Welcome to Personal Branding 101 for Therapists. Now, before I dive into today's presentation, I did want to encourage you to go to tinytigercreative.com. You probably are there all right now if you're watching this. If you haven't already, make sure to download the Personal Branding for Therapists worksheet. Basically, today's presentation is kind of like a walkthrough of that worksheet. So to get the most out of what I'm saying, the worksheet is a thing. Honestly, if you don't even listen to me, just go to that worksheet and fill it out. Because really, that's the foundational stuff that you're going to need to do to start promoting yourselves effectively and consistently online. So go check that out, download that, and I hope you enjoy it. All right, so before we get into everything, I'll just introduce myself, talk a little bit about who I am and why I'm even qualified to talk to you, lovely people. My name is Carrie Walski, and I'm the CEO of Tiny Tiger Creative. I have been designing and developing websites for over 15 years now, and my primary areas of expertise are in WordPress and Squarespace, although I do a lot of strategic work for people as well, helping them think about their online marketing. All right. I have a background in the arts and also a BA in psychology from Macalester College, where I graduated with honors. And I usually don't mention that, but for therapy, folks, for counselors, I do like to mention it just because I do think it is something that I bring to the board that is kind of special. Most web designers out there don't have any kind of background in psychology. So it's kind of nice working with somebody who has an understanding of some of the things that you're helping people with and also a basic understanding of, HIPAA compliance and things like that. So I do mention that for that reason. All right. That's me. Tiny Tiger Creative is, of course, my business. And what I do there is pretty simple. I design one-day websites for professionals like you. I work with a lot of therapists because I've kind of gotten into that niche. So I have a lot of experience working with folks. And basically, what we do is we get together earlier in the day and we work until 5 p.m. and we build you a website. The only reason, of course, that we can do this is because there is a lot of careful strategic work that you do in the form of what I call my personal branding bootcamp in advance of our one-day session. So without that homework, we definitely wouldn't have the content needed to get things done. But yeah, that's the shape of it. And it's appealing for a lot of people who just want to get a website completed quickly and have one that's branded and beautiful and kind of just want to get off their butts and do it. So that's who I am. And I am doing this series because really I want to connect with new people. And I believe the best way to connect with new potential clients is to provide value. So that's why I'm putting all this free stuff out. All right. So you are here, of course, because you want to grow in some way. Congratulations. That's awesome. Either you're interested in working with a different type of client than maybe you've been currently working with, you're starting your career potentially, or, maybe you're interested in going independent. And whatever the reason, you're probably thinking to yourself, how am I going to build my client list in order to make this shift happen? You've also probably realized, wow, okay, building clients does mean marketing myself, and that does mean talking about myself online, which might make you say yuck, which is kind of understandable. I personally really don't particularly like marketing myself. I know, very ironic, because I don't like talking about myself. So that being said, I find that it's often helpful to really change your framework around how you think about this. As therapists, I know you do a lot of that work with your clients, so I'm going to do that now with you. Really, it's not about you at the end of the day or any insecurities that you might have. It's about helping the vulnerable people who you're trying to connect with answer one big question, and that is, can I trust this person to help me? And, if you think about some of the reasons that people try to connect with you, it's understandable that in their vulnerability, really, this is the question that they're trying to answer. And if you think about it from that perspective, suddenly, it kind of removes like the ickiness of like self promotion. Like, you are in a profession where you're not just trying to make a buck, you're really genuinely trying to help people better their lives. So taking that perspective, really shifting from digital marketing to online trust building can be very helpful as you kind of dip your toes into the water of this whole marketing and, self-promotion thing, which can seem kind of scary and weird. All right, so to help you do this today, we're going to take a look at a couple of different perspectives, different things. We are going to first talk about knowing your clients, identifying your target clients. It's very tempting to try to say, I'm going to be all things to all people, but that is definitely a trap. We're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about knowing yourself. So once you know who you're trying to connect with, how are you going to present yourself so that you do appear as the trustworthy professional that they need. We're also going to talk about putting yourself out there. So where are you going to put yourself so that people will actually find you? So we're going to talk about online directories, website platforms, a little bit about social media. We're not going to go super deep into that stuff because really they could be other presentations and of themselves. In fact, I'm going to be doing other free presentations for you about many of those platforms, just so you can get started. But it's nice to know, at least, if you're looking at your busy calendar, where should I go first to start, putting out these threads that people can, draw back to find me. So that is what we're going to be taking a look at. All right, so who are your target clients? Well, let's first talk about what target client or target customer means. Basically, it comes to us from the business world as a concept, and it's those people, those particular people who you are really best qualified and best interested in engaging with and serving. That's what that means in a nutshell. So when you're trying to figure out who these people are, I think it's helpful to think about who inspires you and who gives you energy. And in terms of the number of target clients, I recommend not having just one, but two or three, maybe four, although that might be pushing it a little. Uh, and I say that because oftentimes, I know from personal experience working with therapists that if we drill down too deeply into one single client, oftentimes, our interests do align with our own personal trauma. It can get taxing to work with only one type of challenge. So having a small grouping of people who you really are qualified and interested in serving can help sort of manage your energy in such a way that you're not always drawing on an empty cup because you're talking about a trauma that relates to your own personal trauma potentially day after day. So yes, having 2 to 3, maybe 4 target clients, I think is a great place to start. And yes, that is what I'm going to say about that. All right, cool. So again, when you're thinking about target clients, capping it at 3 to 4 is what you want to do, because people who kind of claim to help everybody don't really help anybody, including themselves. If someone comes upon your online directory presence, let's say on Site Today or ZenCare, one of these things, and they see you have, 20 different interest areas and modalities and different types of challenges that help people with, it's not going to come off so much as you being like super super well informed. It's probably going to come off as you being sort of disingenuous and maybe even desperate, frankly. So really be selective, be strategic, and give yourself the room, of course, to always revisit who you want to work with. You don't have to think of these different things as set in stone. You can evolve how you're positioning it yourself over time if you find that maybe what you have been doing hasn't been working for you. All right, cool. So that is what I'm going to say about that. Yeah, and here's actually a good example of kind of the fallout of not being selective about how you present yourself. In research for this presentation, I did take a peek online to see, what information there was in there about how therapists are marketing themselves, what questions therapists have about marketing themselves. And I did find actually a fair amount of kind of great posts on Reddit here. This is from Reddit, where people were hurt about having connected with a certain professional only to find that actually they really didn't have that experience that they were thinking they would based on what they were seeing in their online profile. So there is a collateral damage, to not being selective. So just another thing to keep in mind. All right, so here's some homework for you related to creating, an understanding of your target client. There is a target client profile exercise in my free worksheet. Um, just copy paste it and use it, as many times as you need to kind of create a clearer vision of who you're trying to connect with. Also, something that could be interesting just as sort of like an exercise is to go to, some of these places like Psych Today and just look at what the different categories are, because there could be certain aspects about yourself and your identity and your expertise that maybe hadn't thought about really leaning into. So that could be kind of a cool exercise. So check those places if you kind of, just want a creative thinking opportunity to think about how you could position yourself. And then, as I was kind of talking about before, this is information that you're going to want to refine on a periodic basis. So, if your interests evolve, if your expertise changes, if you've been sort of focusing in something different, make sure to go back to that worksheet and rework it, to include this new vision of who you want to try to connect with, and then update your online information accordingly. I do recommend, this is great advice that I got recently, to make it a date. Really, literally block out time in your calendar where you are going to have some sacred time to work on your marketing. And honestly, this is just good advice for any kind of business thing that you have to do. Really making that space is going to help you do it. These things are very easy to forget about once you get them up and going. All right, cool. So next we're going to talk about your messaging itself. So you've got an understanding of your target client. Okay, how are you going to talk about yourself and your expertise in such a way that you're going to connect with those people? So I think it's helpful to do a couple things in advance before writing your bio. Sit down and think about how you would like people to describe your work and you as a professional. Think about specific phrases and also think about different emotions, that you want people to feel both in your presence and also online. Really developing an understanding of that vibe can be super helpful when you're doing anything from writing content to picking visuals. All right, so writing a bio, I think it's helpful to, write something two or three times and then cut, cut, cut. So write first, edit later, and have, I would say, 2 to 3 different versions of your bio. Have like a very, very short, maybe 3 sentence version, have one that's longer, that's maybe about 200 words, and then have still another one that's more complete that you might use maybe in a more academic setting, that kind of thing. Having those 3 different versions will help you in a pinch to just send people information, whether you're speaking at a conference or if you're creating a new profile somewhere. All right. I do think it is appropriate to include some personal information. There is a lot of understandable concern about disclosing too much in this particular field. However, it is also good to remember that you are a human being and that people want to relate to you as a human being as well. Just to give you an example, I've worked with a couple of therapists in my life personally, and one of the therapists that I had the best rapport with was a woman who I found, because she said in her bio that she was an artist. And because she was an artist, it made me think that, hey, here's someone who can understand my particular brand of weird, right? And I went on to have a very productive, like, therapeutic relationship with her. She was fantastic. So I think it's okay, to talk about some of your personal interests, some of your hobbies, so that people do, kind of get this feeling about who you are, and also that, you can vibe and work together. I think that's totally okay to do. It's also helpful when you're considering your content to look and see what your professional crushes are doing. So who are those people who you admire in the sector, and how do they present themselves online? That can be super helpful. Of course, you're going to also talk about your credentials and qualifications, you know, your licensing, where you went to school, all of that comes to mind very easily. I think it's also helpful for yourself personally to keep just a rolling document of all of the different seminars and classes and things that you've done to keep up with your licensing as well. Because sometimes there are, well, first of all, it's easy to forget all that you've done, first of all. And second of all, if you find yourself gravitating towards a certain subject later, you can look back and maybe pull on some of those things, maybe add some of those things to your LinkedIn profile, for instance, to, begin signaling to people, hey, this is an area that I've got some specific expertise in. So, do yourself a favor and have a Word document, keep it up to date with all that information. All right. So, we've just talked about your bio. The bio is kind of like the foundation of what you're going to need for a lot of your online spaces, like directories, for instance. A lot of these online spaces, of course, also come with opportunities to do other things like put together blog articles, post little updates about who you are and what you're doing. It is super helpful to think about what type of content that you're going to put in those places and how you can keep it branded before you actually start doing it. So from a content production standpoint, I think it is helpful, when you're thinking about blog posts that you're going to write, that kind of thing, to ask yourself, how can I put my own unique perspective on what I'm talking about? So if you are like a big Lord of the Rings fan like I am, maybe talking about resilience, through the lens of, you know, the hobbits and kind of what Sam and Frodo did to keep going in Mordor, could be a really meaningful and also fun way for people to connect with these things that you're trying to tell them about, and also show a little bit of your personality at the same time. So that can be a fun way to just keep that content generation creativity going. So think about things like that. Also, I think it is helpful to ask yourself a couple of serious things about your personal life, about your politics, and how you're going to represent those things online. So personal life, for instance, like you might decide that talking about hobbies are okay. Maybe sharing photos of your pets is okay, but you're not going to maybe share family photos, or even share the first name of your spouse. It's kind of helpful to think about these things in advance so that, when you're kind of excited about something in the moment, you don't maybe make a decision that in a different, more strategic state of mind you wouldn't have done, basically. So good to just think about that in advance. And those things are more relevant in spaces like LinkedIn, for instance. You know, Other spaces are more sort of buttoned up. You might not have those opportunities. Regardless, could be helpful to think about, especially if maybe you're on Twitter and some other spaces where you do have more of a personal profile. So always things to think about. People can find you, as we know. All right. Another thing to consider is just how you're going to talk about politics online. There are, I'm sure, many topics that are very important to you, and it is acceptable to, share your opinions about things appropriately. It also can be easy sometimes to kind of get caught, in the moment, in flame wars, in negative comments, with people who are maybe saying incendiary things online. So really figuring out what topics you are going to talk about and how you're going to talk about them. I will write, for instance, a thoughtful post about, how such and such community is being treated right now. However, I won't comment on things. These decisions can be helpful, just again in terms of helping you figure out how to represent yourself and stop yourself from maybe making some poor decisions impulsively when you see things that are emotionally charged online. All right, great. Another thing that's helpful when you're thinking about content and, again, how you're going to try to connect with people is thinking about if you can have any takeaway pieces for people. So when I say takeaway pieces, I mean like downloadable content, downloadable ebooks, worksheets, video recorded webinars. These are helpful ways for people to feel like they're getting some value from you, which they absolutely are. And also for you to, really showcase your expertise and your trustworthiness to them. So I think, these are things that can be super valuable for folks and super simple, like, 5 ways to, de-stress right now. You can teach people about, circle breathing or something like that. They're super simple and can also help you even develop your e-newsletter list as well if you're looking to, develop a list of potential clients for the future, that kind of thing. So you can have, one of these pieces essentially, behind like a gated form, where people have to fill in their first name and their email address to get it. So yes, another sort of useful strategy when you're thinking about content and content marketing. All right, so photographs. I'm going to be talking more about photos actually in a future free session that I'll be sending out to you if you do not unsubscribe. For now, let me just give you some thoughts. I would recommend getting your photos professionally done. Do not do a selfie. If for no other reason than the fact that honestly, when you're doing a selfie, unless you got super long arms, uh, you kind of seem literally too close to the camera. When people are looking at a photograph of a person, there's a sense of psychological and emotional distance that comes into play, and it has to do with the literal distance between the camera itself and the photo subject. So if you have a photo and it's kind of too tight around your face, it kind of makes you feel like you're right in someone's face, which can seem kind of aggressive, honestly, or just like not give people quite the professional vibe that you're trying to put out there. So for that reason, no selfies, don't do it. If you can't get a professional photo taker, then have a friend or a loved one take some photos of you, with your iPhone or what have you. That is going to help with that issue. Definitely don't use photos from like your friend's wedding or that hot photo from like 5 or more years ago. Really, the rule of thumb, and I think it is a good rule of thumb, is every 5 years, get some new professional photos of yourself because your look does change over time. And you don't necessarily want to surprise people, when they come to see you for the first time that you look different, whether that's your hair is dramatically changed or what have you. So that is my guideline there, even though it's kind of painful because some of those photos I'm sure are super awesome. All right, cool. So what to wear? This gets back to this idea of who would my people trust. What I recommend is really wearing something that's kind of like a more polished version of what you wear day to day with a client. If you're working with CEOs and you're always wearing a power suit, good for you. Uh, you know, have your photos done in that power suit. Chances are that's not who you're working with every day. So again, having a more polished version that's reflecting the people that you're trying to connect with. So if you're teens, probably less formal, adults and couples, maybe slightly more formal. That's going to help you find the right tone in terms of dress. All right. If you're doing professional photos, where can you take them? Of course, if you have someone in your life who's a photographer, who's professional, awesome, hire them to do it. Having photos done on office or on location is really fantastic, if you have spaces that you feel show well. And particularly with the location part of it, there can be an opportunity as well to get some exterior photos and interior photos that can be helpful for newcomers, new clients coming in to feel familiar, feel like they, know and understand the space before they even come in. So that can be super handy. Other opportunities, though, there are some good opportunities to get studio shots. Suna is one locally that's fantastic. It's a woman-owned photo studio, and what's nice about them is they also have the opportunity to not only take sort of traditional, portrait shots, but they have a couple of like different sets there where you can have some shots of you taken in a living room set, that kind of thing. So it can kind of make you look more dynamic, which is nice. JCPenney portrait studios, they still exist, guys. They really do. Believe it or not, you can get some really great shots here too, provided you don't do those textured backgrounds from the 90s. If I catch you doing that, shame on you. Solid background colors only. Neutral background colors. I recommend like a white or tan. Okay, great. And this is a little more advanced, kind of above and beyond photo taking. I think if you're going to go through the trouble eventually to create a website, for instance, it's helpful to even now think about what kind of colors and what kind of fonts you might want to use so that everything that you're kind of building with respect to your marketing can be cohesive and sort of match that thing in the future. So creating a color scheme is a super fun thing to do. That website that I linked to there, coolers.co, is a great place to start. You can kind of play around or generate random ones. It's awesome. I do recommend for your photos to wear a color from that color scheme for an extra cool bonus, looking like you're in charge and you're put together. That is a nice thing to do. And picking one or two fonts, this is particularly helpful if you're going to be creating graphics for yourself online. Having something that's consistent, having something fun or bold for headlines is great, and something readable for copy is super helpful. And again, when you build a website, if you build a website, that's going to be things that your designer can use to, again, carry that brand forward. All right, great sources for fonts. Canva.com, which is a graphics generating, service that has great templates. That's a great place to start. Or fonts.google.com, that is a source of free fonts. And many of the fonts that are on there are also available on a lot of major web platforms too. So that could be a great way to ensure whatever you pick is actually going to be usable on a website somewhere down the road. Okay, great. So we've talked about all these ways to sort of put together your story and your visuals. Now, where do you put those things? The four core places for therapists to promote themselves online are online directories. So we're talking about Psychology Today, we're talking about Zen Care, we're talking about Therapy Den. There are more and more of them than ever before, which is pretty cool. So that's what we're talking about there. Your personal website, of course, if you choose to have one, and LinkedIn and Google for Business. Which I'm going to be doing a presentation about actually down the line. So stay tuned for that. Okay, cool. So we're just going to do some high level discussion about these things. So online directories, they can be incredibly helpful, and many of them are relatively affordable, especially when you look at like the cost per use, cost per client of them. So, keep that in mind as you're considering which one you want to do. Sometimes you might be tempted to be thrifty, but if you figure, even if you get 3 different clients from a single online directory per month, and you can track that, then it might justify your presence there. So, something to think about. So figure out which ones you're going to do, of course, and then my recommendation is to present yourself consistently and professionally across all of those that you choose. Unless you maybe want to do a little bit experimentation and feel like, gosh, I'm curious about presenting myself in this particular way because I'm kind of learning more about this treatment modality. You could maybe even, in effect, do a little A/B testing by saying, like, on Therapy Den, I'm going to present myself this way, and I'm going to see if I attract those people. That could be kind of a cool way to experiment with, maybe shifting your focus as a clinician. Something to think about. All right, great. Website platforms. There are a ton of great ones out there. I'm only sort of presenting different ones that I have used and trust here because there are a lot of not so great ones out there. If you're thinking about what type of platform to do at a certain point, what I would recommend doing is really looking for things which are called website builders instead of content management systems. Technically, a website builder is a content management system, but these are the terms that people are using to sort of distinguish between these types of software platforms. So website builders, why I recommend them for people kind of your scale, like the individual, therapist, they provide a platform that's secure, where the software is upgraded in perpetuity, if I can get that out, and they're affordable. So Squarespace is a wonderful example. It's very user-friendly as well. These are among the reasons why I use Squarespace, with clients like you. On the other hand, you may have heard WordPress, for instance. WordPress is a great software and it is very extensible. There's lots of things that you can get it to do, but it doesn't really make sense for individual therapists, I find, by and large. It doesn't really make sense for a lot of businesses, by and large, because it is so complex and because often you're hosting it independently. And if you're hosting it independently of WordPress.com, for instance, then you personally need to stay up on things like software upgrades and plugin updates and stuff like that. And if you don't do that, and even if you do, quite honestly, your website may become a vector of attack. So in other words, it could be hacked. So for that reason, I would recommend probably not going with one of the bigger content management system providers, even though sometimes, like WordPress, it can seem like it might be quick and easy and cheap to do. In the long run, I think it might cost you more, particularly if your website is hacked. So that's my 2 cents on that. I am a WordPress developer and I do use it, but I really use it for larger clients. And then I have an ongoing support product, which I use with them to make sure that things are kept updated. So buyer beware there. All right, so LinkedIn is also a wonderful free resource. The truth is, you may end up using it primarily to connect with colleagues, but that's okay because colleagues, as you know, are huge referral sources for you. So having a presence there and keeping it updated, keeping some of those relationships going with your colleagues who are sending you referrals that are good, do consider doing that. I think it's a wonderful way to, again, stay connected with people and provide value to your community by, referring people to them who are appropriate and vice versa. All right. And then there is a cool feature to, of course, on LinkedIn, which is the LinkedIn recommendations. This is where people can basically leave a little review of you as a professional. Of course, as therapists, you cannot ask clients for recommendations or reviews online. However, there is no rule about asking your colleagues for recommendations. So if there are people who know you and trust you, consider doing recommendation swaps for them, because even though it's coming from that collegial sort of perspective instead of a client perspective, it still has value, for people to be endorsing you online, and it does help you show up, higher on searches for things that relate to your area of expertise. So consider doing that. I think it's worthwhile for that reason. All right, cool. Here's a recap of today's session. We've talked about a lot of fun stuff. We have been looking at the fundamentals of online trust building for therapists, both independent and those who just want to develop their own personal brand online. We've talked about target clients, what they are, and who they are, how you can identify who these people are. We've also talked about understanding your professional story and how you can kind of begin to develop your own message, through developing a good bio, but then also through developing strategic content that you share online. We've talked about photography and what you need to succeed there, different ways of doing that. And then we've also talked about different places where you can put this information. So we've talked about LinkedIn, we've talked about online directories, we've talked about websites, and I will, in a future video, be talking about Google for Business for therapists, which is super useful, even if you're doing entirely virtual work. That's something that we're going to talk about in that video, so stay tuned for that. Great. So if you have any more questions about this content, about what I do through Tiny Tiger, I would love to hear from you. You can find me on LinkedIn and direct message me there, or you can, of course, email me at carrie@tinytigercreative.com. In fact, if you're on my website right now, you can go and find my contact form and connect with me through there. All right. So next up in the series, I'm going to do a number of these. If you don't unsubscribe from this list, then you're going to be getting them. We're going to be looking at 5 photos you need to be successful online. So basically having a head and shoulders shot is a great place to start, but there are different types of photography that will be super valuable for you as you try to promote yourself across different platforms. So we're going to talk about what those things are. We're also going to be looking at SEO and web accessibility for therapists. So just the basics that you need to know there. Fun fact, SEO and being accessible for people using different assistive devices online actually goes hand in hand oftentimes. So that's kind of cool. It makes sort of doing both well a little bit easier. All right, we're also going to be looking at Google for Business for therapists, which will be a super interesting one. A lot of people have a lot of questions about this one and some trepidation about even using Google for Business, but we're going to talk about why it's valuable and how you can use it. And I'll also be doing some demonstration with this one, which is super cool. So if you feel sort of intimidated about filling it out, about getting this started for yourself, then no worries. You can basically just look over my shoulder and see how I put together a profile. So that's going to be a fun one. Yeah, these are just to start. I will be releasing these periodically, maybe on a monthly-ish basis, certainly not more often than that. If you have other questions, other topics that you'd like me to tackle, certainly reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you again. Also, I do have a short survey that's linked to beneath this whole video on my website. So if you can give me some feedback about how it was, what you thought about it, I would love to get that. All right, great. So thank you so much for attending this session, and I hope to see you at a future Tiny Tiger virtual session like this.